Gentlemen, let us start today without preliminaries, and let us have the slide, let us have the first slide on, and let us have the lights down, because I wish to talk to you today about the career of Francisco Goya. And I want you, first of all, to start off by thinking about that issue of contemporaneity, and the fact that it's not simply that David and Goya are contemporaries, but at certain times they are painting pictures which have a great distance between them, because Goya is painting in Madrid very largely, or in the country estate of the Duchess of Alba. Not till the very end of his life does he become a refugee, though it's fascinating that both Goya and David end up as refugees, exiles. Goya in Bordeaux, in France, and David in Brussels and Ghent, in Belgium, which at that stage is part of the Netherlands. But at the very time that David is painting Marat, Goya is also going through a great life crisis, and let's have a look at the next and see what Goya is painting. Now, these little group of paintings I'm going to show you by Goya are small. They are painted on copper, little copper sheets, and there's always been a deep debate as to exactly when they're painted. But modern scholarship tends to push them up into that period immediately after Goya recovers from his first life catastrophe. He was born in 1748, and so he's well over 40 when the first real catastrophe occurs. It's a catastrophe of a long, protracted, dangerous, and ultimately very disabling illness which leaves him absolutely deaf. And, of course, such a sudden eruption, such a catastrophe, tends to be taken hold of by popular novelists and worked into a tremendous, significant event. But I don't think there's any doubt that, in fact, for Goya, this illness was, as they say, traumatic. As a young man, he didn't come from a grand family, and he didn't immediately make his mark when he moved from the provinces to Madrid. But quite rapidly, he went to Rome for a very brief period, and then he became a very substantial success. And we know from letters to some of his childhood friends how much he enjoyed that success, and how buoyant, rambustious indeed, his temperament was. And so that at the end of the 1780s, he's really riding a kind of career crest. His immense success. He's becoming not only a depictor of scenes of daily life for tapestries and that kind of thing, having already mastered the art of fresco painting, he's becoming a royal portraitist. He marries the daughter of the first painter to the royal family, Goya, and becomes a royal appointee. And then quite suddenly, and you have to think about this in very personal terms, Goya meets this disaster. And think of it, there are certain advantages to being deaf if you're painting portraits. You don't have to listen to the interminable chatter of the Duchess of Alba, or the Marquis Jovellanos, or indeed anybody. On the other hand, it really does reduce your powers perhaps as a courtier. And one of the things we have to remember about Goya is that he remains in some sense as a court painter. Anyhow, whatever we make of this illness, and doctors of historians of medicine have not been entirely clear exactly what was wrong with him, it is the case that in the aftermath of that illness, his style seems to undergo a deeper level of change. But we have to associate that with one other thing, and that is that the period from 1792 to 1794, which is a period of his illness and his visit to Cadiz, is also the period of the Jacobins, of the sans-culottes, of the mountain, of the guillotine going at full speed. It is the period of the assassination of Marat. And so we have to see these views, and let's have a look at the next Goya, This is painted, I think, slightly earlier, maybe, and it's a procession of flagellants. And one of the things, of course, that immediately brings to your mind is that, of course, whatever the powerful bubblings of the French Revolution, in Spain you have a society which creaks in a much more frightening kind of way than French society did in the 18th century, which has many more archaic institutions still going full blast. And it is a society in which the church, decadent, mouldy, like an old Gorgonzola cheese perhaps, is nonetheless infinitely more powerful, and there is still the possibility of the auto da fe, and there is still openly on the streets religious possessions, including those of flagellants. And it is, you see, fascinating that Goya is interested in the nude in this totally anti-heroic way. One of the things that we shall explore during the course of this hour is the relationship of Goya and David and Canova to certain aspects of the nude. And Goya's feeling for the human body is so very anti-neoclassical. It is so anti-sculptural, and it has about it a preoccupation with the humiliation of the human body and its essential brutishness and ugliness. A brutishness and ugliness which, of course, becomes greater and greater in his vision as he becomes older and older. And indeed, the career of Goya is one of the most fascinating because it's one of the longest careers in the history of art, and it's one with the greatest number of vicissitudes. And Goya is a painter who, if he had died at the age of 40, would never be on our lips, I think. Indeed, if he died at the age of 50, he might hardly have been on our lips. It is in the latter part of his life that he's most dramatically innovative and extraordinary and frightening, and in many ways you might even say debilitating, but inescapable paintings occur. Though you will already notice in this something which is important, and that is that not is it simply a question of a somewhat rum and odd subject, but it is also a question of some rather disturbing and frightening shapes. The hats, with their strange, pointed craziness, and their underlying surrealism. And then the brilliant shapes of the flagellants, loincloths, and then the sense of tonality, and in fact something which you will have noticed off and on in the 18th century, but becomes very pronounced in Goya's work, a savagery of making which goes with the savagery of subject matter, and a violence of tone very often, though I must admit this is not a very good slide. Let's have a look at another painting which is probably perhaps from this period. A different and more frightening and more empty prison. Or is it a prison? Perhaps no, it's a Lazar house. A Lazar house, one of those hospitals where the moment you showed any signs of getting any kind of plague, and there must often have been little outbreaks of displeasing illnesses in Madrid, which was a new town, but nonetheless, in some ways, a rotten city. And, of course, it is one of the preoccupations of the early part of the 19th century. No sooner has Black Death, the bubonic, died out in Europe when you're having to worry about the smallpox, and no sooner the smallpox succumbed to the attacks of Dr. Jenner and cow serum, then cholera is on your doorstep. And this may be a Lazar house, and here may well be some poor charnel creature in the last stages of death. And indeed, look at the old doctor who himself looks like a grinning death's head. Because I think one of the things that one has to notice immediately in Goya is a kind of savage, ironic, and desperate humor. What can Goya do as he looks deeper and deeper into the pitfalls and horrors of life? And Goya himself, we must realize, is by nature drawn towards the Illuminati. He's drawn towards that whole tradition in the 18th century which starts with the philosophe, which we talked about in terms of the Freemasonry behind Mozart's magic flute, and which, you see, the latter part of the 18th century is full of, particularly in terms of enlightened despotism. The enlightened despots of the latter part of the 18th century would not seem terribly enlightened to you and me, but they were reformers, and they were determined to introduce better hospitals. They were determined to introduce a more rational civil service, and so on and so forth. And actually Spain, for a short amount of time in the second half of the 18th century, fell under the sway of a fairly enlightened, really fairly despotic person, Charles III. And I'll show you a Goya portrait of Charles III in due course. And Goya himself allies with the liberal nobility, and for very short spaces of time, Jovellanos and so on, a group of reforming nobles, which were very like some of the reforming nobles in France. Remember that Mirabeau, who was such a leader of the revolution in 1789, was in fact the son of a noble, was a nobleman himself. We must not think of all the nobles as being rank reactionaries. On the contrary, and Goya joins that group, you see, so that for him the collapse of order in society has a specially dreadful meaning, maybe, and he can only greet it by the defense, the typically modern defense, the particularly difficult defense, the particularly unavailing defense, let me suggest to you, of irony. When we face up to the horrors which are done in the name of humanity in the 20th century, perhaps our only fig leaf, our only protection from our own coarse, crude nudity is just the little fig leaf of irony, the fig leaf of a grim, despairing humor. And maybe that's what Goya has here. Anyhow, these small paintings, and there are a number of others, done more or less immediately in the wake, and you can see in The Burial of the Sardine, which belongs to, roughly speaking, the same period, may have well have been done before he had this shattering illness. The whole of his mood tends towards a deepening questioning of every rank in society and every kind of activity. And if we look at the individual faces here, we see people who remind one already of the world of Enso, and here is one of the great masks which you might have worn last Friday, and Goya is already ripely laughing his sour, savage laugh at the follies of all kinds of human beings. And I think you can see it particularly in one very fascinating thing. I've talked a little bit already about Goya's attitude towards the naked human body, but his attitude towards clothes is almost equally frightening. Clothes which make of human beings horrible, decaying bundles of dirty linen, which create surrealist shapes as frightening as burning papers in a great act of incendiarism, as frightening as the mysterious blots and blobs when blood drips through a ceiling, shapes of utter misshapenness, clothes which remind you that we are always living in our own winding sheets, that we are always, in fact, suppurating with our own sweat inside our disgusting man-made fibers. Not that, of course, the people in Goya's period wore man-made fibers, but a sense of clothes as being an extra disfigurement on creatures that are already curiously disfigured, I think begins to get at Goya's world for you. And, of course, as you all know, his mood deepens. His experience in the latter part of his life is so strangely mixed. And you have to think of him, his eyes more and more glued on the festering society of Spain, more and more watching day after day, and nobody being able to soften his visual experiences by saying, but my dear Goya, you know, we really do rather enjoy eating children. Or, you know, it's only a painting. Or, well, you know, there's a very good reason for shooting these French people. Goya can't hear the dulcet, remonstrating tone of the human voice, is unavailable for the oratory of the word. And I think his view of life is deepened by the fact that it cannot ever come to any of the sweetening effects, any of the hypocrisy of words. So that by 1818, 1819, Goya can sum up his vision of mankind as preying on itself, as Lear says, like monsters of the deep, We have to remember that this, of course, may well, however, be a vision of Saturn. And Saturn, you see, is an ancient god. And Goya thereby inherits something, perhaps, which is also typically Spanish. An anti-heroic view of the gods, which we can trace very easily back to Velasquez. Okay, let's go on. Right at the end of his life, he is still preoccupied with horrid scenes. This comes from a notebook which was left unfinished in 1828 when he died, and in that period he is still experimenting with new techniques. In the late 1820s, for instance, he is doing a number of very teeny paintings in watercolor on ivory, and he is still trying out his grotesque figures, and here we see a captured mad person in all the starkness of his sketchbook vision. Let's have a look at the next. Ran right at the end of his life. And this one says, oh, it's too silly. Far too old to marry. And there's another drawing which I wish I could show you of an old man, similarly antique, similarly senescent, old but still learning, is what Goya says underneath it. And it is fascinating again to realize that Goya, when he is at his most acerbic, when he's at his most bitter, adds words as though he can hear his own refrains and as though he's got to label his own terrible inner fancies. So that you can see the total career is one of extraordinary fascination. But the fascination deepens if we go back and we look at the early part of his life. And here we see him as such an unpromising young man. I mean, if you were a young man who looked like that, you might not want to paint your self-portrait. You might say, well, I'm going to wait a bit. I'm going to do some aerobics or something. Or I'm going to find a rather more cheerful mood. This is Goya as a young man in the early 1770s, I think. It's not a painting which is at all familiar to me. One of the things, of course, that must strike you immediately is, yes, unprepossessing, and you wonder how he's going to be a success in Madrid when he gets nearer the court. But also, of course, a very good painter already. Not bad at all as a painter, good at manipulation of pigment, and frighteningly honest. Frighteningly honest. And I want you to think about that honesty, because it isn't exactly a self-caricature. It is very easy, of course, to be dishonest by simply caricaturing yourself into tremendous hideousness. This is just unpromising. The deep dint in his chin, which, as you know, will collect little nasty little corpuscles and blackheads and sweat and so on. And then a mouth which is at once sensual and rather insensitive, you might say, and rather pushy. And indeed, one of the things we might want to accept about Goya, like many another artist, he doesn't have an awful lot of nose. He may already have realized how like Rembrandt, in some ways, his unpromising physiognomy was. And it may be that this was one of the things that pushed him towards Rembrandt. But Rembrandt, Velasquez, and nature were his gods. Let's have a look at another self-portrait. And we see him now, you see, much more of a sense, much more self-confidence, skipping around at a really rather nice large canvas, seen against the light, seen experimentally, but seen well, in what costume? The costume of a bullfighter. And Goya is nothing if he isn't a rather tough creature, really strong. And he has that kind of rootedness in Spanish customs, and he, of course, throughout his life is fascinated by bullfighting, and towards the end of his life he actually does some lithographs of bullfights, but he does a whole series of etchings, aquatint etchings, called the tauromaquia. And I cannot explore the tauromaquia in any detail. I just want to ram home that fact that he was an amateur by showing you one of his drawings of bullfights. And that interest in the bullfight then descends in a very interesting way. It has a long history in art, because the tauromaquia then influences Manet. And Manet is one of the great inheritors of Goya. Notice just a couple of other things about the bullfight. First of all, that it is a popular affair, and depictions of the bullfight are not for the nobility per se, or the gentry per se. They are, that kind of aquatint would be for quite ordinary people to enjoy. Secondly, the preoccupation with the moment of death, the moment of pain, with the issue of laceration, with the unpleasant aspect of the relationship between human beings and animals, and with, after all, a crowd which is tumultuous and presumably often lusting for blood. Goya is not a little weakling. He is nothing if he is not the opposite of namby-pamby. He's a toughie. And you can see that in this etching, can you not? He looks round the corner with such disdain at you, but also as though to say, well, I'm a very interesting person indeed, but I wouldn't advise you to let yourself too close to me. And I'm pretty horrified by life. Look at my lower lip. You just try and make that expression yourselves, and you begin to see how you feel if you look like that. And it's pretty incriminating in its own way, one might say. And then the strange and disagreeable eyebrow bristling away, and the nose full of a certain kind of curiosity, and then the somewhat laggard gaiety of the brim of his top hat. A fascinating visage, done at the time, of course, of the Capriccios. And then a completely different vision, full-bodied. One might suppose somewhat after dinner. Unhappy, searching, stern, in middle years, and quite clearly with a sense of a deeper haunting. I mean, in both the Capriccios portrait, etched portrait, and this, you have a sense of the hauntingness. You have a sense of his fascination with wear and tear. And then, perhaps the most extraordinary of all his self-portraits, done in 1820, when he is in his 70s, 74 perhaps, and he is very nearly killed by an extremely serious illness. And he does this as a kind of votive painting to his friend, Dr. Arietta. And the doctor is at the crisis of his illness, and Goya is about to expire when his doctor, with all the power of medicine without the show, brings him a reviving draught, and Goya then paints this extraordinary and very rare painting. I can think of no other comparable painting of an invention of a self-portrait in extremis with a rescuing doctor. Again, I think the doctor element might well go back to Rembrandt, because you remember Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, and the anatomy lesson of Dr. Detmar. And in fact, in those nudes, Rembrandt prefigures Goya, just as Rembrandt prefigures Goya in so much of the chiaroscuro, the use of light and dark, the use of lighting to create dramatic effects. But here is Rembrandt as a young man with Saskia on his knee, and I show you this just to ram home the relationship. But actually, of course, Goya's first wife was a rather dull girl. We know very, very little about her. She was the daughter of Bayeux. We're going to have a look at a portrait of her. And certainly Goya shows absolutely no sign of painting a jolly picture like Rembrandt did of himself with Saskia on his knee of, I think her name was Josepha. She dies in about 1808, and then as a man of about, what would it be, nearly 60, Goya immediately seems to develop a fantastic and extraordinary affair with a young woman called Leocadia Weiss, who is about 18 when he first meets her, and who becomes his companion for the last 20 years of his life, and obviously has the same kind of rejuvenating effect upon him, and exciting and dazzling effect, and inspiring effect, and yet mystifying effect, and liberating effect, as many of the young women had upon Picasso in his later years. And from the rather dull young Miss Bayer to the extraordinary Leocadia, who is here seen against the most mysterious rock, actually in that famous house, the house of the deaf man, the Quinto del Sordo, which was the villa that Goya retired to just outside Madrid, where he did the black paintings, the paintings of his nightmares. And she is opposite those nightmares. She introduces you to Saturn devouring children. She introduces you to witches' Sabbath. She introduces the tall, gaunt, frightening old man, and she contemplates them, and it's almost as though you see he does this portrait of her contemplating him and all his hideous and feverish, nightmarish fantasies, as though she is some kind of lodestone, dragging him, inspiring him, whiffling, urging him forward, and urging him to control his night thoughts. So Rembrandt is part of Goya's background, and notice that Rembrandt had not been an important master for much of the 18th century. Towards the end of the 18th century, Rembrandt becomes exciting again, because you see at the end of the 18th century, color changes again. Rembrandt could not barely be very popular with Watteau, or Fragonard, or Boucher, or Tiepolo, because, or Hogarth even, because Rembrandt paints in chiaroscuro, in dark and light, and with rich browns. And it's the drama of Romanticism that goes back to Rembrandt. The other artist is, of course, Velasquez, and this speaks much more to the Spanish side, and he speaks to another issue. I'm showing you now 3 portraits by Velasquez of Philip IV. And I think they're so important because, you see, the moment Goya got involved with the Spanish court, 2 things happened. First of all, he had to start painting people who were even more hideous than this chap, if you can believe it. But also, of course, he got to know Velasquez better and better and better. And one of his first acts as an artist is to do a series of copies in etching of Velasquez. But here is Velasquez, Philip IV, and I'm showing you Philip IV hunting. Look at the extraordinary heavy chin and that cumbersome lower lip. One wonders how, Philip IV could have eaten things like Jell-O. Not very easy. And you will also wonder how he managed to keep his moustaches in such a way. Well, he wore moustache cups every night in bed. You'll be interested to know that the 17th century people sometimes wore a sort of little funny cup to keep their moustaches from getting battered. Anyhow, let's have a look at the, you see, and Goya then does, this is Charles III, the enlightened despot. And you can see it is modeled to some extent. There he is, Charles III going out shooting with his dog. It's modeled on those Velasquez royal portraits. And if Velasquez, you see, one of the great puzzling things is how on earth could a royal person allow anybody to paint them looking so absurd? But it seems to be that, of course, one conclusion is that they really actually were a good deal more absurd, and this is relatively flattering. It's not very easy to believe that, but it's possible. The other thing is that they were they didn't mind. They were quite satisfied. And it is actually true that, one will get out a little photograph of oneself and say, that's me. And really, one should be saying, well, I hope to God it isn't me. I suppose it is me, but I'm going to get a facelift immediately. It really is one of those strange things. Of course, this is a fairly early Goya, done in the 1780s, and we see that his capacity for honesty does not decline facing the royal family. But that capacity for honesty is, after all, as I suggested to you, a tradition which he inherits from Velasquez. And here is Velasquez in old age, painting his patron Philip IV in old age. And as you can see, Philip IV used to come often in the afternoon to Velasquez because Philip IV got bored with court duties and would say, oh, my dear Velasquez, what are you painting this afternoon? So Philip IV was an enlightened connoisseur and did not mind. But Goya had this tradition of unvarnished statements in the way of portraiture. Indeed, one of the things that is very difficult to convey to you, because there's so much of Goya, that the vast bulk of his painted work is concerned with portraiture. He does an enormous amount of portraits for about 45 years, and many of them have the same kind of honesty. There's another one of Velasquez of Philip IV, and then you see, here is Goya doing a Velasquez on Ferdinand VII. And if Philip IV was a disagreeable-looking character, would you prefer this munching, crafty, silly, creepy creature as your monarch? And Goya only, I think Ferdinand only sat for Goya once, and their relationships were not a little bit sour, but in fact, because of his position as a royal painter, Goya had to paint a number of portraits of Ferdinand from about 1810 onwards, and there's one famous painting in which Ferdinand's face was put on and taken off because of the political situation in Spain, just as you know, in Paris, one day it'll be called Avenue Stalingrad, and the next day it'll be called Avenue Khrushchev, and the next day it'll be called Avenue de Gaulle, and then it'll be Avenue Mayflower. So, I mean, that head would come on and off one of these paintings. But I want to draw to your attention while we're looking at it, look at this, because of course Goya didn't simply get a ready-made attitude towards royalty from Velasquez. He got perhaps the most educated paint that Europe had seen. Now, what do I mean by educated paint in this sense? It is paint which corresponds to an extraordinary analysis of the visual world and its translation into brushstroke. And notice that this is also true about Rembrandt. We think of Rembrandt as a great psychologist, and Goya is also a great psychologist, but Rembrandt was also an extraordinary manipulator of pigment, with wonderful passages of rich impasto and sudden glazes, and then slashing brushstrokes. If you look at the Rembrandt of Jan 6, there are brushstrokes which have such freedom, such untrammeled capacity to suggest gold braid and yet be a mere little slash of rather dull yellow ochre. And you look at this bejeweled order round this ass's nincompoopish shoulders, and you then look at the actual way in which it's painted, and you realize I showed you Velasquez silver Philip IV in that wonderful silver bouquet. Let's have a look at the next, and you can see it. And here's another member of the royal family, painted by Goya, and we'll have a look at her again, but she's scarcely a beauty. She might remind one of the famous remark made of an English queen that about the age of 40, the bloom was just beginning to come off her ugliness. But again, look at the brushstrokes. Look at the brushstrokes, and then look at the absolute certainty with which Goya. It isn't. You see, it isn't just a business of being honest. It is his ability to suggest that curling, chewing mouth, and that nose dipping into it as though seeking for something extra, and the blearness. Eyes that are blear, but you see, because they belong to a royal personage, don't really have to see anything anyhow. Okay, let's go on. And here we see, and it really is, I didn't look at it close enough, but this is actually, it's based upon a Goya etching, and the Goya etching is of Velasquez's famous painting. Let's have a look at the next. Los Barracos, the drinkers, the topers. And you see, Velasquez didn't only offer Goya the example of portraiture and the example of extraordinary manipulation of paint, he also offered Goya one other thing, which is a deep fascination with ordinary people doing very ordinary things, and indeed, frankly speaking, the anti-heroic, because this is Bacchus, my dear. And is Bacchus a god? No, he's rather a creepy young man. And how about these? Old soldiers, debauched tinkers, panhandlers of the ripest kind. And Goya became an aficionado of the panhandlers of Madrid. Not only the panhandlers, but of course the majos and the majas. Because in late 18th century Madrid, there was indeed a cult by the upper classes of the lower classes. I mean, it's one of those fascinating things that the 18th century sees the beginning of anti-snobbery. That is to say, the well-to-do, the distinguished, the highly bred, aping the manners of the poor. And of course, that very often has a sinister political implication. Sometimes it's simply folly. Sometimes it is something deeper. And that, I think, is really very interesting for you to think about. It is, of course, that what happens is that an upper class, a governing class, suddenly feels itself impotent, suddenly feels itself drained of all its vital juices. And then it wants to go and roll in the gutter because it has this sort of sense that poor people, that the ragamuffins, that the dregs of society have a kind of vitality which the well-brought up, and you know, I'm sure some of you have felt that in your very own lives. that you've been brought up so nicely in some little sweet, jolly suburb of nowhere, that you want to immediately swill in the Bowery or jump about in the Tenderloin or whatever it is. And that mood, there's an element of that mood in late 18th century Spain, and what it does is, at any rate, to tell you, you see that Goya inherits from Velasquez the very widest range of social possibilities. Let's have a look at the next. Here is a fairly early Goya, which is a wine harvest. And you can see that he also had certain other inheritances. And Goya starts off, most of all, I think, with an inheritance which you would expect, because the inheritance of the middle part, slightly modified, of European painting. And actually, there's one other extraordinarily important person whom I wished I could lecture to you at length upon, Giambattista Tiepolo, who was the greatest painter of the 18th century, but unfortunately not the most important. He was the greatest because he was the most marvelous painter, the most wonderful manipulator of paint, wonderful colorist, an extraordinary inventor. But he was not progressive. He was a Venetian, and he did wonderful acres, literally acres and acres, of ceiling paintings in fresco. And he was, you see, too old-fashioned for most of Europe. He started off by working, Tiepolo started off by working in northern Italy and Venice, of course, and then he became a little expensive for Venice, and then he became a little old-fashioned for northern Italy, so he then was commissioned to work in the south of Germany, which was rather more old-fashioned. And the Rococo manages to remain in the south of Germany for a very long time. But then, in the late 1750s, those commissions begin to run out, and Tiepolo is called to Spain. In the early 1760s, he arrives in Madrid. He paints a colossal ceiling, a vast ceiling on a royal palace, showing the triumph, the apotheosis of the Spanish monarchy. And in this last phase, there's no doubt that he influences Goya. And here we're looking at a very early Goya painting, and Goya started off in fresco. And I think that that in its own way is interesting and significant, because there are certain wonderful things about fresco painting. And one of the things about fresco painting is that you have to work fast. And if you work fast, you're more inclined to show your brushstroke. And I think that's one of the things that Goya learns, an absolutely flexible technique. As a young man in Saragossa, and here I think this is from the chapter house of Saragossa, and you would hardly think of it, but in this early age, of course, he is painting Assumptions of the Virgin. And he gets much of his style from the world of Tiepolo. And here is a famous Tiepolo fresco from northern Italy. What is the subject? Well, it's the Judgment of Solomon. You remember that Solomon, two mummies roll up and say, "Hey, that's my baby." And one of them says, "But that's my baby." And the other one says, "But that's my baby." And Solomon says, "Okay, let's just cut the baby in half. You can have half each." And then, of course, the mummy, whose baby it isn't, rushes forward and says, no, it's not my baby. And here's the scene, and here's the executioner, and there's a poor little baby, and there's the mummy saying, "No, it's not." And there is Solomon. And look at your point of view. They are zooping into the distance, into the Empyrean. You've got an extraordinary foreshortened point of view. Your eye point is somewhere right down here. Look at the little baby down there sleeping. And then look at the extraordinary arrangement and the brilliance of the colors. Well, Tiepolo, again and again, was capable of doing things of similar light-hearted theatricality. He could even make the Judgment of Solomon sort of rather a light and humorous affair. And here's an angel appearing to Sarah, and look at the angel. The angel is sort of showing a lovely leg to everybody. And you see a light-hearted treatment of religion. You also see the most brilliant and wonderful. I mean, if you could just see the details of this and see the brilliance of the brushstroke and the easy rococo toings and froings, the light-heartedness, and that gets into, to some extent, Goya. Not so much this, which is a circumcision, but it gets into the mood of Goya when he gets to Madrid. Let's go on and have a look, because that's another very early Goya. Indeed, in the 1770s, Goya is not totally unlike David. He is a Rococo painter. And this is just another, this is Minerva, and this is an early David, remember, like the Seneca, and it's not unlike the world of Goya. And actually, Goya, like David, it looks as though he might be moving just towards a bit of neoclassicism in the 1870s, and then the Rococo phase comes back on him. This is a pan by Goya, and he must also have been aware, I think, of some other French painters. In particular, he was probably aware of Fragonard. And this is a Fragonard, and the Fragonards of the 1760s and 1770s are very like the early tapestry designs which Goya does. And here's an early Goya tapestry design. And let's have a look at, here's another Fragonard. And they're so close, aren't they? Shepherds and shepherdesses. Let's have a look at some more of Goya's tapestry designs. And here is one actually executed as tapestry. It's a kite. It's a detail from the kite flying. And you'll begin to see the typical late Rococo parsley tree. And you see elegant young people. But notice that Goya's young people are not anything like as elegant as French young people. They have much clumsier feet, and they're in much more extreme postures, and there's a kind of giggle or smile on Goya's. Now here's the original, and you see this is in fact is really a rather rough bust, and he would smell of garlic if you got close to him. And those French people did not smell of garlic. There's something more earthy. And here's Goya doing a design for a dance, and we begin to see him in the late 1770s, still very decorative color, still a very decorative and highly idealized landscape, and very, very idealized people. And yet, you see, this chap hasn't really bothered to shave very well. And if we look at, he did an enormous number of them, and gradually you begin to get a sense of something not very nice happening. And I think you can begin to feel it in this one, that the games aren't all that pleasant, and that you wouldn't really terribly like to be the blind man in the middle playing at blind man's buff. And what a smirky-kirky creature this one is. And he's got pretty beady eyes, hasn't he? And you notice that beginning, the strange disfiguration which is produced by the clothes. And then quite suddenly you realize that Goya, in these scenes, can take the mickey. And I wouldn't terribly care to be given over to these dear ladies. They do look, of course, an innocent group, but in fact, she's absolutely grotesquely amused. If you could see her face more close up, she's having such a wonderful time bouncing this poor little mannequin to and fro. Of course, that's about 1790. What happens a little later? By 1810, all the veils are pulled aside. But we mustn't rush to 1810. Let's get back to about 1790. And about 1790, Goya does this picnic. And you think, yes, well, Goya's still working in the manner of Antoine Watteau. And indeed, the trees still seem a little bit like those exquisite ostrich-feathered creatures. But Watteau would never, 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 never allow anybody to vomit out of fête galante. And she has got violent indigestion and is just about to belch. And, I mean, these people they're red with drink. They're a boozy group. And compare them with the elegance of Watteau. And you see what a world of difference is beginning to emerge in Goya in the 1780s. Well, elements of the Rococo Goya, elements of the fresco painter, elements of the religious painter Goya managed to keep going until the middle, indeed towards the end of the 1790s. And this, which is the Church of the Florida, which is just outside Madrid, was a new church, was decorated with frescoes by Goya in the 1790s. And you see a general view. I'm now going to show you, it's a very big scheme. I'm now going to show you, you see, that goes back again to Tiepolo. And here is a very famous Tiepolo, the Triumph of Apollo at Wurtzburg. And there you can see that how, come on, Goya descends from it, because here's the cupola in the Florida, and you can see he uses here all those tricks of illusionism, and he uses a good deal of the color of Tiepolo, but it's got darker, it's got slatier. I wish you wouldn't go out of that door and let so much light in. And when you examine the details, we see that in fact lightheartedness is not all that apparent. The young people are all right, but the old person is slightly worrying. The thing that is extraordinary, and you can see, is the wonderful milky splashiness of the brushstrokes. But let's look at the next, because the next seems to me, well, there's another Tiepolo. You can see the relationship. Here is St. Francis himself, and now look at this poor creature who is being cured. And you look at a body which is characteristic of Goya in the 1790s. And then you begin to look at faces which are hollowed out of old potatoes. And then you look at the next slide, and you see, in fact, a very fascinating detail. How this supplicant is at one stage a human being, and then maybe a pan, and then maybe a real ripe devil, just because somebody interposes an arm. And you come to the fact that in the 1790s, Goya is playing not only with religious painting, but with diabolism. And here is a comic, but rather frightening little witch's Sabbath. And in fact, Goya's religious feeling, let's have a look at the next, is always complex. A premonitory sense of Goya's deepening disturbance with the world which he's inhabited actually is apparent by his 40th year, 1788. In this, his 42nd year, so 1788, in this design for a tapestry. Now, this is a very odd design for a tapestry, isn't it? The wounded stonemason. It's far from being a cheerful thing which you could weave on the loom with a great deal of pleasure. Equally, just a little later, we have one of his rare, genuine landscapes with a snow scene. So that his mood is deepening before his deafness. And so we come to the burial of the sardine, and we come to that crisis in his own affairs. And here you can see a detail of it. You see how brilliantly it's drawn. One of the interesting things, my dears, is that Goya, whom we know as a great draftsman and a great printmaker, really starts drawing in a serious way in the middle of the 1790s, when his mind is drawn more and more and more towards these scenes of terror. This one, a scene of cannibalism from the story of Jesuits in Canada. It's a Canadian scene, actually, interestingly enough. And so, you see, he begins to be concerned with possession, the possessed, the maddened, and he does this wonderful one of a curé who has gone right out of his mind. And that, of course, can remind us of one other thing, and that is that Goya inherits the world of Cervantes, doesn't he? And this is the world of the fantasies of Don Quixote. The world where people mistake donkeys for human beings, and in the light from small lamps, shadows flicker in a truly crazed and frightening kind of way, and people in their despair call upon more and more dubious powers of greater and greater darkness. I didn't even have to whack that time. It's really quite interesting, because actually Goya has two crises in the 1790s. He has his illness, and then he has his mysterious relationship with the Duchess of Alba. And here are two portraits of the Duchess of Alba. This is a slightly earlier one. And the Duchess of Alba's husband dies very suddenly, as I recall, in about 1796. And then Goya goes and lives at San Lucar with the Duchess. And nobody can be quite certain of the terms upon which they live, but he's there for about the best part of a year. And it is during that time that he starts, at least so far as we know, he starts using some small notebooks in which he draws a small number of youngish female nudes or semi-clothed women, some of which are clearly very closely related to the Duchess. Out of this period comes his one really great female nude painting, and it's also quite clearly a moment of a turning point in his relationship with the aristocracy. And I think after his relationship with the Duchess of Alba, his satiric bent, his determination to mock and criticize becomes much, much deeper. So we come to the really enigmatic painting of the 1790, the clothed and the naked maha. Well, the mahus and mahas, they are men-servants and women-servants. They're confidential servants, and they wore a particular costume. As I've told you, there was a cult of mahoism in Madrid when noble people dressed up, you see, in the dress of the common people. And here we have these mysterious pair of paintings. And it is now, I think, generally thought that one would hang in front of the other. It is also, I think, generally claimed that this is the Duchess of Alba, though how we can be absolutely sure, I don't know. The paintings belong to the collection of Manuel Godoy. And Manuel Godoy became the Prince of Peace and was, in fact, the fancy man of the Queen of Spain, whom we will see shortly. Here she is clothed, spread out, and of course she is related very directly to the great Venetian paintings of women reclining, done by, first of all, Giorgione and then Titian in the 16th century. And of course, Titian and Giorgione had their reclining ladies naked. There is a fascinating essay by John Berger in which he discusses the nakedness of the unclothed Maha, and he insists that, in fact, Goya did not do this from life, and that the breasts are pushed up as though she is still wearing a corset. And if you look at it, I think you would have to argue that the breasts are in a somewhat odd position if they'd been sort of allowed to behave themselves in a normal fashion. I mean, the upper breast is really pushed wildly up in that direction. On the other hand, one of the things that really is very interesting about this nude is the existent way in which the legs, and therefore the lower abdomen, and therefore the genitals, are pushed towards you. And there is another thing, the challenging look upon the face of the Maha. She's not sort of giving you a sort of straightforward glad eye. She's certainly not doing what Titian's Venuses do, some of them, which is to look up into the sky as though nobody was present. There's a kind of challenge, and the mouth is pulled back rather. Anyhow, fascinating and extraordinary pair of paintings, and you see really very separate from anything else in Goya's life. His view of legs and hips and shoulders here is not the view of a deeply used and awkward and clumsy and, in fact, humiliating body. This body is not a humiliating body. Most of Goya's bodies are humiliating. Again, it is fascinating to think in terms of the Spanish tradition. There are not a great many nudes in Spanish painting, and this is one of them which was in Spain at the time. It's another Velasquez known as the Rokeby Venus because it finally went to a Rokeby Hall in England. And actually it's an interesting painting because it was also one which was ripped by the suffragettes. They tore it to pieces. They put a knife through the back, and it's been quite skillfully repaired. But notice that Velasquez does you a back view. Goya does you very insistent front view. And there's one other image of the period which I think goes with this, and is perhaps even more extraordinary and takes us back to Canova. And Canova became, like David, involved in the Napoleonic saga and actually in Napoleon's family. And this, in fact, is a very famous sculpture of one of Napoleon's sisters, Paulina Borghese. And here she is from the front point of view. And she is, of course, Eve and Venus, and a very modish and determined woman of high society in her own right. And we must suppose, in fact, that she probably posed very much like this. And we must also suppose that, in fact, her husband actually had this sculpture in a rather dark upper room, and after dinner he would welcome his guests and say, "Come along and have a look at Paulina." And they would go up by candlelight, and there they would see this strange effigy. One of the things that you may say, well, what is this very neoclassical? And you can sense the neoclassicism, can't you? By the form of the drapery, by the quality of the arms, by the nose, by the headdress. So very, very different from the Goya. What does this have in common with the Goya? Well, partly, of course, it just has in common the fact that it is a nu allongé. It's a stretched out nude. But it has another thing in common, and that is that Canova, like Goya, in fact, is deeply concerned with certain elements of realism. And you notice the difference in the material. The bed itself is wooden in places, and the bed sheets are most carefully developed so as to heighten the sensual illusionism of the whole thing. And then it may take us into a third image of a reclining female figure, much the most discreet, in some ways the most famous, David's Madame Récamier. And then I'd like you, just in your mind's eye, to contrast the Madame Récamier with the nude Maha. This so persistently neoclassical, with its ancient Pompeian lamp, with an extremely decorous face, unfinished, and then the robustness of the Goya. Here, very, very beautiful painting, and we know a lot about the actual sitting. Here, the Napoleonic profile, rather fascinating, I think. And here you see a little toy version of the Borghese, just as a kind of mantelpiece ornament, kind of thing that you could buy on the Mall, maybe. I talked about Goya's beginning to draw. And that Goya beginning to draw is really enormously important. And it takes place, as I suggest, in these little notebooks in the late 1790s. Unfortunately, we don't have any really very crucial slide. But this is the sort of thing he was beginning to draw. And in the late 1790s, of course, he gets caught up in politics. He gets caught up in painting the royal family. He moves closer in some ways to the royal family. And, of course, he does his famous portrait after the Velasquez of the family of Charles IV. And here is Charles IV. And if you wondered about Charles III, you're going to wonder about Charles IV and Maria Louisa even more, because they really are the most extraordinary creatures, aren't they? And you can see that their children, like all children, are rather horrified by their parents, and they have very good reason to be horrified. And you imagine them standing for this, and then you imagine the kind of dull, stupid, stupefying conversation that went on, and the sheer arrogance of that royal family. Okay, let's go on, because I want to go one stage further, because, of course, David also had royal occasions to do, and about 1804, David had to do something which must have been just as daunting as painting the royal Spanish family, because of painting what is called the Sacre of Napoleon. That is to say, the crowning of Napoleon, and Napoleon crowns himself, and then crowns his wife, and there he is about to put crown, and of course the Pope just sits in the background saying, "Oh, well done, my boy." And then you have this great problem. There's Napoleon's mummy sitting and looking on very beneficently, and there are all the marshals, and here is Talleyrand, and there are all the ladies of the court, you see. And David is caught up in that kind of ceremonial. If we look at some details, we see what he does with it. And it's not a bad portrait, and, I mean, here we are, he's not being totally dishonest. But if you compare it with Goya's untrammeled treatment, let's have a look at the next. And Goya himself does an extraordinary group portrait. It's the last meeting of the Council of the Philippines, which is in an obscure French museum. And look what has happened. It is so different. Goya takes the inside of this event and shows it to you. He plunges his hands into the very entrails of the decaying Spanish nobility, the decaying Spanish body politic, and pulls out a ruined pancreas and a hobnailed liver for you to look at in these deep, dark shadows. And there is Ferdinand VII himself. And you see what a hollow, hollow, hollow group of men it is. We are the hollow men stuffed with straw. And the fascinating, look at the detail here of these preposterous dummies, and compare it with David's vision of the Napoleonic crowning. And you see that, in fact, David becomes a committed propagandist, which is the opposite, because Goya becomes entirely and frighteningly his own man. Is it time for you to go? I hear a kind of creaking. I hope it isn't, because I've got plenty more to say. 10 more minutes. What? 10 more minutes. Oh, absolutely wonderful. Well, here we have another vision of Ferdinand VII, and I thought it'd be interesting just to take these court portraits a little bit further and compare Ferdinand VII of Spain with David's portrait of Napoleon in 1804. And we can pause over this, because I think it is easy to not to do full justice to David when he's a Napoleonic propagandist. And yet this is really a most extraordinary portrait, isn't it? We notice the time of the day. It is 4:10, but not in the afternoon, in the morning. And Napoleon has been working all night. The candles are guttering. And he is, of course, here, he's cast his sword aside onto this truly vulgar chair. You notice with the ends in the corners here. What does that mean? He's no longer the joyous and bountiful general, the man who conquers Italy for France. He is now the great lawgiver, and stuck about is the Code Civil, the great code of laws which Napoleon gave to the French people, and which is still largely in place in France. And David allows Napoleon to be very slightly chubby just here, and he allows Napoleon, who seems to have been wiping his brow with his hanky, to be losing just a little bit of hair. And if you really look at it closely, you do see what it would be meant by a Corsican ogre. At least you see that this chap might have ended up in slightly different circumstances as a not really very successful pork butcher. But nonetheless, commanding. And notice the other thing, of course, it is all done in a glittering, tight style, in which the brushstroke is allowed no play, in which actual technique is concealed, and in which a kind of highly fastidious and high bourgeois richness of detail is tremendously important. And actually, can you imagine how dull it would probably be painting an element like that? Goya never allows himself that kind of dullness. I want to put in a third painter who nowadays wouldn't be thought of in the same breath as David or Goya, but who in his own time was their rival, which was the English portrait painter Sir Thomas Lawrence. And at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, and after the 100 days after the Battle of Waterloo, Sir Thomas Lawrence went posting about Europe to paint all the royals in Europe, and he was considered, you see, to be quite the greatest portraitist in Europe. I mean, at a time when Goya's name was not known outside Spain at all, Lawrence was a great international figure. And here he is doing a third figure. We've seen Ferdinand VII, and we've seen Napoleon, and this is Prince Regent, the Prince Regent Prinny. And Prinny, you must know, my dear, never went without 2 or 3 corsets. He'd have looked even more interesting than the Duchess of Alba without his corsets. And he became convinced in his old age that he'd actually won the Battle of Waterloo himself and fought there, but of course he was never anywhere near that. And it is a great stage in the decay of state portraiture, because you can see he's a lineal descendant in terms of painting of Louis XIV by Rigaud. There's the same kind of splendid and absolutely unavailing curtain. There's the same wonderful and extraordinary rich tasseling. Just imagine walking forward, this tingle-tangling in front of you. And then the great wonderful ribbons here, all painted with a kind of lusciousness. And if we're to talk about pure painting, if we're to talk about pigmental manipulation, we then have to recognize that Sir Thomas Lawrence, who has very little actually to say about anything, you know, he hasn't got any very deep feeling about the texture of life. He's not a profound psychologist. He has no sense of the philosophical issues about being and not being, about substance, or even about light. But if you want somebody who is a wonderful, wonderful bravura swisher of the brush, Sir Thomas Lawrence is just about as good as anybody. And you look how easily and swiftly he draws this preliminary sketch. And in fact, also, you can see that this is a vain, silly fellow, really, with a heavy, unpleasant chin, and who turns away from you in a kind of turkey-cock distress because he doesn't know whether to be a king or a friend. Fascinating to see. Here's the Goya again. And you see, in fact, what wonderful painters these people were when they were just instantaneously caught in action painting, in the mere movement of the brush, when they had the thing in front of you. And so much of 20th century painting is already absolutely implicit here, down to the moment of abstract expressionism, impressionism. That is to say, a fascination with succulent paint and the possibilities of color for its own sake. You notice one other thing, and that is that the painters of this period always paint on a mid-ground. That is to say, they don't paint on white, so that they get warmth into their flesh tones, because you've got a warm middle ground. Here, and it is interesting, for comparison with Lawrence and Goya, is a sketch by David. And at one stage, there's a kind of insistence upon accuracy, almost dogmatic, almost pedantic, but profoundly impressive in David, and a kind of directness and fullness. And then at the same time, there is a certain limitation. There's a limitation, I think, of something which is a great battle of the 19th century, the limitation of preferring draftsmanship to freedom of color and freedom of brushstroke. And throughout the 19th century, we see that battle. And of course, Goya is so important to the French painters of the middle of the 19th century, from Delacroix through to Manet, because Goya has this great freedom of manipulation. And now I think it's time for you to go. Thank you.